So, in any case, I'm going to start here. Libraries have had, I'm glad that lots of people understand a lot of English around here, thank goodness. Libraries have, for a very long time, assumed that everyone understood that we were valuable. And if most of you come from university libraries, you know that we're spending enormous amounts of money of the public's trust for the library resources that we provide. And we just do not have a great idea of how valuable that service is. We have, particularly when we go out, what we have had heretofore are a lot of just very basic descriptive statistics. We know, for instance, how much money we spend on libraries. We know how many materials, how many books are in our libraries, and we can compare those, rank order them against other institutions. But none of us really, until some instruments like LifeWall, none of us have really had a very good idea of how well we were serving users from their point of view and how we compared in that service with our peers, chosen peers from around the world. So the reason I have this up here is because since I am going to be talking both about, because I only have 20 minutes, I can talk about this forever. I am going to be talking about the development of LifeWall because I was one of the researchers who came up with LifeWall. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about how I use it on a day-to-day basis, year after year, in the management of the libraries that I run, both at McGill and Texas A&M. So the first thing that I'm going to say over and over and over again, and as a senior administrator, I know that unless I say something 10 times, people aren't going to get it. The reason why I put this up here is that it is hugely important to know what you're trying to measure. If you go out and in what we now call a culture of assessment with libraries, if we go out and say, well, I'm just going to measure stuff so that I know that I'm better or worse than somebody else, that's going to get you nowhere. You have to know what you're trying to measure. In research terms, you have to know what your question is. So let me give you an example of a research question. When we developed LifeWall, our research question was, what is service quality in the minds of users of our libraries, and how can we measure that in terms of an online survey? And so we used let me press the right button this time. LifeWall, you'll see, if you look up LifeWall on the internet, you will be pointed to the Association of Research Libraries website. And on that website are, about 50 articles that have been published on LifeWall, a whole history of what LifeWall is, and an understanding of how the instrument is run. It now includes about 1.5 million surveys that have been conducted in about 1,500 libraries around the world, including major libraries throughout North America, South America, Europe, Asia. It's been translated to 12 languages, including Spanish. But also, the most recent version is in Korean. We've also done Hebrew, so that we go from right to left, we had to go from left to right on the screens. So there's an enormous amount of data that allows us to understand how libraries, what users want from our libraries, and how we can compare our individual library against other libraries. So when we came up with this, a while ago, about 9 years ago now. It was funded through a major grant in the United States for the fund for the improvement of post-secondary education. And several major institutions in the United States cooperated in this. What we ended up with was an online survey that has about 21 different questions and a free-form box. And we used every respondent to the survey, and the respondents are chosen as a random sample of your user population, so students, faculty, other people. Respond to the survey online, and they respond to each question from 3 perspectives. What is my desired level of service for this particular thing? What is my current perception, and what's my minimum expectation? So you get this really good view of how you're doing compared to what users want, and then you can compare that against peers, but also probably the best comparator is yourself over time. So I can, for instance, with my library at McGill, I can trace how my users, how my faculty, for instance, feel about our online resources compared to the Association of Research Libraries in the United States, or Oxford and Cambridge, another one of our comparators, and see how our trend line is going up or down compared to theirs. And I can make concrete decisions on the basis of that data. Now, the reason that I think that the data is good is because of the rigor of the research process that went into coming up with LifeWall. And the reason why I put up the slide of lies, damn lies, and statistics was not only to be provocative and interesting, but also because I believe, particularly as a librarian, that information is good no matter where you get it. And you just have to make sure that it's rigorous, that you know how to use it, and what it's all about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different kinds of data. And this is very brief and in some ways very elementary. But again, I hope to get across my point. And if you only have 3 takeaways from this, that would be good. So quantitative information. I'm a big believer in what we call mixed methods. Mixed methods, both as a researcher and a practitioner, someone who's trying to run a library. So I believe that quantitative information is just jolly if you know what your research question is. Again, you have to know what you're trying to get and get at. So with quantitative data, if I want to know how tall someone is, I can just look at that really easily and see that this woman is she's within the average population in height, but she's at the low average. And I can do that because there's this great scatter plot up there on the wall. So that's pretty easy. And there are many useful descriptive statistics in our world. For instance, demographics. We have found in LifeWall that the biggest difference between how users feel about our libraries and how they work is not whether they are from humanities or science, whether they study English, poetry, whatever, but the kind of user group they are. In other words, undergraduates look at things very differently from faculty and graduate students. So those are some of the big things. So it's important for us to know how many of each one of those groups there are, because we know they're hugely important. And those are just basic descriptive statistics, incredibly useful to us. But if you go out, as some of my colleagues have, and say, well, I'm going to do statistical analysis testing, you don't know what your question is. You only use inferential statistics when you've got a question that involves inferential statistics. So, in other words, when I want to know if something that I did makes a difference, whether it really has been meaningful because I've invested a lot of money in it. For instance, in information literacy at my campus. So I can have a control group, and then I can run a test before the students take the class and after they take the class. And I can see if there's a statistically significant difference between the results. And then I can make conclusions from that. But I know what my question is. My question is very simple. Is there a difference between this particular intervention and student learning? So again, no matter what you do, first think about what the question is. Okay, this is probably what I really want to focus on a little bit. I do believe that you can get a lot of good information in our libraries from qualitative information. I think that it is incredibly, but again, it must be very rigorous. So if I want to know, for instance, the question that we used in LifeWall, how do I know what library service quality is from the perspective of a user? I can't count that. I have to go ask people what that information is. Focus groups. You can use focus groups as long as the methodology is very rigorous. Focus groups, surveys, interviews, observations, and now you can't see that, so I'm going to come here. There is a whole research methodology that is as rigorous, I warrant, as rigorous as that for the quantitative research methodological world, and actually parallels it. And it is called naturalistic inquiry, constructivist inquiry, whatever. It involves the two main things that you do when you're studying something in a quantitative world, reliability and validity, except there are different ways of coming up with reliability and validity assurances in qualitative data that are very different from quantitative data. Quantitative data, you run some statistical packages and you say, voila, or you say this doesn't work, and then you go back. With qualitative information, you can use a statistical software package, something like Atlas PI in vivo, come up with content analyses of lots of verbal data, and then you can draw pictures. And that's what we did when we put together the survey questions for LifeWall. We interviewed users, faculty, staff, and students from major universities in North America, and we then analyzed that data to come up in a very rigorous way, which took forever, to come up with what the components of service quality, drawing models of what service quality was in the mind of users. And then we developed research questions. We developed survey questions around those concepts. So if you look up here, this is taken, I don't have a lot of time. This is taken from, it's adapted, at the bottom of this it says Lincoln and Guggen, if I can find the right thing here. There's a book called Naturalistic Inquiry, published by Egon von Lincoln in 1985. It is called Naturalistic Inquiry. It's published by Sage. I'm sure you have it in all of your libraries. It is still in print. It is the single largest book constantly in print, published by Sage. And it has two components, basically. Half of it is the epistemology and the ontology of qualitative methods. And then the second half sets out a very rigorous methodology for conducting naturalistic inquiry studies. And basically, if you look here, where you end up with things like internal validity, these are the mechanisms that you would use in a naturalistic inquiry sort of study, and reliability here, right here. This is how you would do it consistently, dependability of information. This is what you would do in a qualitative study as opposed to a quantitative study. Reliability is something, for instance, when you're doing surveys that if you have done that, you use a statistic called short box alpha. So this is synonymous to that. If you do this, again, it depends upon your research question. what method that you use. I'm going to say over and over again. Probably the 5th time I've said, know what your research question is. And then you find out what sort of tool that you want to use. Okay, again, in quantitative work, reliability of data is hugely important. You get that by studying sample size, response rates of surveys, for instance, and representativeness. And those representativeness is the most important. These are easy to get now. For instance, let me just throw out a question. We've got 30,000 students at McGill, and we want to know what size our sample should be to get reliable and valid data when we run lifelong. So how big should our sample be? Well, there are lots of questions involved that to think upon. Whether you want students who use certain libraries, or if you want representation from faculty and staff and students. But basically what you want your sample to look like is your population, your student and faculty body. But I used to have to look at tables and work some arithmetic, some algebra to figure out what the sample size should be. Now you go on the internet and there are great packages that show you want this kind of sample with these sort of stratifications. You need this many people. You need this sort of response rate. You need this sort of sample size. It's so easy. You have to know what you're doing. You have to know what your research question is in the first place. But we aren't stuck with the angst and just the grunge work of a lot of these studies in the way that we were before, because there are so many tools at our disposal. And so because there are these tools at our disposal, there's no reason, I think, for us to be, as librarians, when we need to assess what we do, to be conducting research studies and analyses that just aren't very rigorous, because the methods are out there, the tools to use them are out there, and they're pretty easily available. And the other thing is that we really don't have an excuse now for running our library simply by the seat of our pants, without information. It is a time, we are in a culture of assessment. It is a time where we need to have data to make management decisions. The stakes are really high. Okay, I just want to show you, if you like to do math, there it is. There's Chromebox Alpha. Yeah, you plug it into a statistical software package, it doesn't look good. But again, you gotta know what you're doing. Again, don't just do this willy-nilly and say, oh gosh, this is a really pretty graph, it's gotta be real. Okay, so this ends my little talk. And just in the takeaways, I really wanted, again, I'll just reiterate very quickly. Rigor and good data is important to practicing librarians from two really important perspectives in my view. One is if we're going to put together assessment programs in our libraries, and I maintain that we have to do that. We simply have to do it. Things are changing so fast in higher education and in the publishing world, we simply can't afford to be spending the dollars that we spend now, the pesos, and the Canadian dollars, and the euros, in the willy-nilly, assuming that the world thinks that we're great, the world that we had previously. When we conduct these studies, we need to know what we're doing. You start with your research question. Your research question will dictate what kind of methods you use, whether they're qualitative methods, whether they're quantitative methods, or whether in a practical world they're a combination of the two. So, thank you very much.